On today's Jerusalem Dateline, Benjamin Netanyahu states his opposition to a Palestinian state. Military analyst Jonathan Conricus talks about the rebuilding that will happen in Israel and Gaza after the war. Plus, the role of UNRWA in educating generations of children in Gaza. And standing with Israeli communities under fire. How CBN partners are making a difference. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israel and the U.S. are facing off over the future of Gaza and the establishment of a Palestinian state. Both U.S. and Israeli leaders are making their case publicly. Take a look. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once again stated his opposition to a Palestinian state.
I tell this truth to our American friends, and I also stopped the attempt to impose a reality on us that would harm Israel's security. The Prime Minister needs to be capable of saying no to our friends, saying no when necessary, and saying yes when possible.
He also laid out his plans for Gaza.
The destruction of Hamas, complete demilitarization under Israeli control, and a civilian administration that does not preach the destruction of Israel, does not teach the destruction of Israel, and does not send terror toward Israel. I think these things are not that complex. I would be happy if Gazans can be found to do this.
Following U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent trip meeting with Middle East leaders, the State Department is laying out a different vision.
Without a tangible path to the establishment of a Palestinian state, there are no other partners in the region who are going to step forward and help with the reconstruction of Gaza. There are no other partners in the region who are going to step forward and help establish Palestinian-led governance of Gaza.
Given the continuing disagreement, NBC News now reports the Biden administration could be looking for another leader beyond Netanyahu, reportedly meeting with Israeli opposition leaders. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Israeli President Isaac Herzog explained his country's feelings about October 7th and beyond.
Israelis lost trust in the peace processes because they could see that terror is glorified by our neighbors.
He also addressed suffering in Gaza.
I'm not shying away from the human tragedy in Gaza. And you want to know something? We care. We care. It is pain for us that our neighbors are suffering so much. But how else can we defend ourselves if our enemies decided to entrench themselves in an infrastructure of terror of unbelievable size?
Meanwhile, Israel marked what it sees as the saddest birthday in the world, as Kafir Bibas, the youngest Hamas hostage, turned 1 on Thursday. While Israel carries out its mission of eliminating Hamas, fighting is also escalating with Iranian proxies in Lebanon and Yemen. I spoke with military analyst and former IDF spokesman Jonathan Conricus about the latest in the war and where it could be headed. Jonathan Conricus, you were there in the IDF spokesman's office at the beginning of the war, now outside, senior fellow for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Here we are, 100 days plus after October 7th. Take us through 2024. What do you see ahead right now?
I feel that we are in for a very challenging year. The main challenge will be how Israel will be able to sustain medium and high-level military operations over a long period of time, and how the state of Israel will be able to balance running a country, generating revenue and taxes, keeping a governing and political system in order, and defeating enemies, all of them at once, starting with Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, focusing on them, getting that job done, but then quickly availing itself to allowing Israeli civilians to go back to their homes in northern Israel.
As you said earlier, Israel's facing like an unprecedented situation with maybe 7 fronts. You have Hezbollah, the Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq. You have the Houthis. You have the West Bank. One of the fronts that Israel is facing is the media front. But before I ask about that, I mean, in all of this is Iran behind all these different fronts.
It is.
Are we facing the possibility of a regional war?
I think that the events of 2023, specifically the Hamas massacre of October the 7th, and the direct involvement of the Houthis, guided, equipped, and funded and ordered by Iran, brings us closer to that. I think that there are many powers in the region, the US and others, who would want to avoid that. I don't think that Israel is looking for a war, but I think that we are closer to understanding that the source of instability in the Middle East is Iranian aggression. It is Iranian expansionism.
I've been up in the Galilee recently, and a lot of people, and as you've said, about 100,000 Israelis are now internally displaced, cannot go back to the northern border because it's so dangerous. And the people that I've talked to say they don't see any other way than, as they put it, the north opens up. I mean, is it inevitable that Israel will eventually deal with its biggest threat besides Iran?
Israel really is trying to prevent that. You know, if you look at events from October the 8th and until today, Hamas has been attacking. Israel has been responding in a very, very measured and, let's say, with a lot of strategic patience. The idea has been, based on the understanding of how severe a threat Hezbollah poses and would pose to Israeli civilians,
it's much greater than Hamas.
I think we're nearing the stage where the window of opportunity for diplomacy to really have an effect and to avert war, that window is narrowing, that gap is narrowing. The time really is now for any such deal to come into effect. What Israel, I think, needs in order for Israeli civilians to go home to their homes is for a 7 or 10 kilometer buffer zone to be created inside Lebanon, where there's simply no access for the worst Hezbollah terrorists to get close to the border. Then Israel will have to deal with the massive arsenal that Hezbollah has been able to acquire and stockpile. That needs to be addressed as well. But the most imminent threat is access to Israeli civilians across that 80-mile border that separates between Israel and Lebanon. And that is non-negotiable. That needs to be taken care of, and Israelis need to be able to go back to their homes. Thankfully, Israel has strong and steadfast allies around the world, which stand by Israel, which support Israel, which stand up for what's right. When Israel is dragged into a court by South Africa on slanderous claims, democracies around the world, most democracies defend Israel and say that what South Africa is claiming is just, well, diplomatically they're calling it unhelpful, and we don't agree. I think that stronger words could have been chosen for what the fact that South Africa decided to be the legal or the diplomatic branch of Hamas, whitewashing Hamas crimes.
Yeah.
I think it is very unfortunate.
And we'll see how that works out. Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Jonathan Conricus, former IDF spokesman and now Senior Fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thanks for your insight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, more from our one-on-one with Jonathan Conricus and the war of narratives playing out in the media right now. The Israel-Hamas war has rippled across international headlines. Military analyst Jonathan Conricus breaks down what he calls the tremendous bias against Israel in the media. Take a look. You were there on the other front that I mentioned, the media front. Talk us through what happened, how you've seen in the past 100 days plus, how the media portrayed the war in Gaza.
Well, the media, a big term.
Yeah.
And we'll have to distinguish, of course, between different countries and different media organizations. I think in Israel, people understand how absolutely important it is for Israel to be out there and fighting on that battlefront as well. It's a very diffuse and very challenging and very dynamic front. Even messier, I think, than the real battlefield on the ground.
And you've been on that battlefield for many years.
I've been on both, on the ground as a young company commander a few years ago, as a younger man, and then in the realm of public affairs and media. Both are very important, and I could say that, you know, the challenges that the IDF faces on the ground, fighting Hamas, their tunnel system, etc., I can see similarities that Israel has in the court of global public opinion and in what we call media warfare. Facing a lot of bias in general, I'm making a generalization here, but many times I think facing tremendous bias, Israel is held to, I think, sometimes impossible standards. We're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. We're damned if we ask Palestinians to evacuate northern Gaza ahead of our attack, because you mustn't ask civilians to move. And you're damned if you hit Palestinians, civilians, as a part of the fighting, and they die because they didn't listen to your warning. So in any case, it's very difficult to really do the right thing in the eyes of many editors and journalists who have this very strict manuscript where Israel is the bad guy, Palestinians are the poor, oppressed, whatever, never mind that they massacred, never mind that they called for genocide, never mind that Hamas's charter is to annihilate the state of Israel and kill all Jews. That is very underreported, but the script is a very tight and very stringent one, where Israel is held to almost impossible standards, and our enemies, even though they are internationally recognized terrorist organizations, are given a pass many times. It's okay for them to use human shields. It's okay for them to embed themselves within the civilian population. It's okay for them to use UN schools and hospitals. It's okay for them to terrorize journalists and bully them into reporting only what Hamas wants to be reported. All of that is okay, but then if Israel asks civilians to evacuate because we're going to operate there, then that's not okay. So there's many, I think, injustices being made. Thankfully, I think Israel is strong enough to be able to defend itself.
Jonathan Conricus, Senior Fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. It's great to be with you and great for that insight and analysis.
Thank you.
Up next, a UN agency stands accused of using American taxpayer dollars to fund terror and anti-Semitism in Gaza. In the U.S., government leaders have accused UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, of using American tax dollars to fuel hatred and terror against the Jewish state. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
After the 7th of October, everything changed, and we have to take down the mosque. Whatever was cannot be in the future. If we want a different future, that we'll be able to live here securely, things must change, and it starts with UNRWA.
Knesset member Sharon Haskell created the caucus to reform UNRWA 9 years ago.
UNRWA is an organization of the United Nations that is a complete cover-up for Hamas activities. They are inciting and educating children to violence and hatred. They're teaching them martyrdom, how to be child soldiers. That's their education system. It's based on radical Islam.
In caring for so-called Palestinian refugees, its website states, UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief and Works Agency's services include primary and vocational education, primary health care, relief and social services, and camp improvement. Refugees live in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip.
We need to understand that UNRWA is not an organization that provides education and welfare and health care. That's merely the facade. It's an organization that has two deep roles: to ensure that the conflict from 1948 remains an open case, and therefore that there is a permanent question mark on Israel's very existence, creating a generation after generation of Palestinians who believe that one day Israel will not exist.
Dr. Anat Wilf says that's why the Palestinians have been kept as refugees, believing that one day they'll win the 1948 war. And she adds, UNRWA relieves Hamas of any humanitarian responsibility. That was confirmed by a senior Hamas member who said the tunnels are meant to protect Hamas from planes, and it's a responsibility of the UN to protect the people.
There's a generation that does not know that UNRWA was started in order to undermine the state of Israel. Count Falk Bernadette, who was the first UN mediator, He was upset with the right of the law of return.
That law allows Jews worldwide to immigrate to Israel.
So he said the Palestinians have to have the right of return, their inalienable right to go back to where they came from in '48, instead of being, absorbed like any other refugee.
David Bedin started Israel Behind the News to expose teachings and practices going on inside UN facilities in Gaza and the West Bank.
We have been through 1,000 school books used by the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA. We were offered by a prominent rabbi $10,000 for a research grant to find anything for peace. I said, look, I'd like to have your money, but it doesn't exist. It is one system, not for hatred, but for murder.
Bedin says although his organization produced 24 films and research projects over the years, people didn't believe it until October 7th.
What we filmed along the Gaza border and also in Judea Samaria were children being trained to murder in their summer camps, kidnappings, rapes, firing on IDF vehicles, etc. Now they're listening.
Knesset member Simcha Rotman says Israel is stuck with UNRWA and will need to take care of it.
But the fact that countries that object to terror, that do not see any reason and would look in a very harsh way on anyone who will try to educate people to murder their own children in a school system should look the same on UNRWA.
He says UNRWA funding needs to stop.
So the fact that UNRWA gets money from the US, from other countries, as a donation, and this money supports terror, actively supports terror, needs to stop. There is no excuse for educating for terror. There is no excuse for facilitating the next October 7th.
Wilf says, unfortunately, Israel cooperated with UNRWA for years, thinking it was a moderating force.
Israel has to do a 180 and declare quite clearly that it will no longer cooperate with UNRWA. UNRWA provides no benefit, and no country that is a friend of Israel should give any money to UNRWA.
The United Nations is a hornet's nest of Jew hatred, is a hornet's nest of deception, is a hornet's nest of terror-supporting policies and organizations.
Dan Diker of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs says Gaza has become a forward base for the Iranian regime.
Today, it's the Iranian regime that is mobilizing UNRWA with its Hamas proxy to incite to the murdering of Jews and Israelis, to carry out acts of terror. They have sanctified as a strategic objective the destruction of Israel from within UNRWA compounds and organizations within Gaza.
Diker says an international body led by the U.S. should be formed to supervise UNRWA donations until it can be dissolved and responsibility given to local Palestinians. Though they have different ideas about how to deal with UNRWA, experts agree that whether UNRWA is dissolved immediately or over time, it's clear that changes will have to be made. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Julie Stahl and I continue discussing UNRWA in our studio and its far-reaching effect on dynamics in the Middle East. Julia, that's a powerful story on UNRWA. We've done stories on UNRWA for many years and interviewed David Bedin, who's sort of been like a voice in the wilderness for many years, reporting on UNRWA, and many people haven't been paying attention. And now they are because of what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, they are. October 7th was it was like this perfect picture of what happens when decade after decade you educate children, you send them to summer camps where they learn how to use weapons and they learn to hate the Jews, not only hate the Jews but kill the Jews. What do you expect? Generation after generation, they've learned this. And I'm not saying that they're not responsible for what they're learning, but it's pretty serious.
Has it been a surprise to you and others that after the war, during the war, we've found so much complicity between UNRWA and Hamas?
I can't say I was really surprised, but yeah, I think it really brings it forward, and if we think about how it's funded by the West. It's your tax dollars. In 2022, the U.S. was the single largest donor to UNRWA, $344 million. It's like, excuse me, but those are your tax dollars. You're actually paying for Hamas to learn to kill Jews. That's a problem. And I think, you know, with this day after scenario and the U.S. pushing for UNRWA to be part of the equation of the solution, well, something needs to happen with UNRWA if that's going to be the case.
And it was the Trump administration that cut funding to UNRWA, and then the Biden administration reinstituted that.
They did. They resumed it. And like we said, you know, it's a lot of money. And a lot of it goes, you know, salaries to the terrorists, salaries to or Hamas members, if you want to just call them that. But, you know, this is all like propagating the hatred, the murder, the theology, if you want to call it that Israel does not belong here. The Jews do not belong here. We want to get rid of the Jews, finish with it. And it's maybe nothing new under the sun, but this is the latest iteration of this horrible anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and we saw that in full bloom there on October 7th. But it's not just in Gaza. It's also in the West Bank. You were there on the ground in Jenin, and tell us what you saw there.
Yeah, you know, and we were actually in a refugee camp there, United Nations refugee camp there, and there was a young man, and he was super friendly to the journalists and everything, and he told his story, and his story was that he's 26, and he had a security offense. We didn't know what that was, if it was throwing rocks or shooting at somebody or whatever, and had been in jail in Israel for 2 years, and so therefore he couldn't get a permit to work inside Israel, and there were no jobs in Jenin, so therefore he was just going to have to join Islamic Jihad if he wanted a salary. And I asked him, like, well, what do you want to do? And he was baffled. It was like nobody ever asked him what he wanted to do. And then somebody who was in authority there later said, you know, actually, people come here and they do projects and then they leave and we're left with nothing. And you can see it. You can see that they haven't developed the society. They haven't taught people how to have businesses or how to, you know, have a successful life. And so what do? They turn to the only thing that's going to pay them a salary. And they've been taught to hate the Jews, so why not? That seems like the logical thing to do. And I'm not at all absolving Palestinians, but I'm saying, like, if we're funding this, if the West is funding it, we need to say, hey, wait a minute. There's something going on here, and it's not good.
And final question, Julie, you know, behind this, behind Hamas and the Gaza Strip, and also behind many of these groups in the West Bank is Iran.
That is for sure. This has become Iran's way of getting at Israel. There's kind of a not so nice little saying here that, you know, the Iranians, they'll spare no Arabs to attack the Jews because they're not Arabs. You know, in other words, they're perfectly happy to expend Palestinians or Lebanese or Syrians or whoever to attack the Jews, because it's no skin off their nose. They just put the money into it, and their ultimate goal, which they state very plainly, is to get rid of Israel.
Yeah, that's what they do, and this is sort of that ring of fire with all these proxy groups surrounding Israel trying to destroy the Jewish state. Julie, thanks for your story and your insight and analysis.
Thank you.
Still ahead, a local pastor is serving Israelis on the front lines of Hamas rockets, thanks to the support of CBN Israel. Israelis spend every day facing the threat of rockets from Gaza. CBN Israel is on the ground helping families regain a sense of normalcy during the war.
CBN Israel is in Sderot, which is a city in southern Israel that for the past 20 years has come under a constant rocket bombardment. We spoke with Pastor Michael Biener of City of Life Ministries. After October 7th, most of the city's residents evacuated. Michael and his congregation are working hard to help those who remained.
In year 2001, when the terrorists from Gaza start to send rockets daily, they proclaim that we want to do the city of Sderot, city of death. And somebody write on the first ejection in the city of Sderot, city of death. And we said, okay, the name of our congregation will be City of Life, because we want to proclaim blessing instead cursing, life instead death, helping with food, personal helping, psychological support that is so important in such a city as Sderot, so traumatized families, children, parents. Now, team of volunteers coming around Sderot to bring to the people who stick in the city.
Today we're delivering to 120 families. You literally don't leave your bomb shelter. Going to the grocery shop is risking your life. So one of the projects that we decided to do was say, okay, let's provide food, but not just cans or stuff like that. You can actually cook a hot, normal meal with chicken and potatoes and vegetables and all fresh. All the stuff that people are used to eating every day, and it's just normal and taken for granted.
The people who still stay in the road, they lose their help what they have in the ordinary life. How they feel they're not alone. Somebody came who really loved them as a Messianics or a Christians. And now we continue also with your help, guys. Thank you for holding our hands. And also part of this work, this is you, because you help us. It's so important for us during the years. Your faithfulness in it.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media and access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And remember to continue to pray for the safety of IDF soldiers, all those caught in harm's way, and for the safe return of all the hostages. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.